last week because that was some wild weather. That tornado blew up literally out of nowhere, but we're back. So it's been a couple weeks since we were in the book of 1 Samuel. Somebody, just quickly, I know I ask this every week, just make sure we're all on the same page, the story so far. Just give me a brief synopsis of what we have seen in the first 4 chapters of 1 Samuel. Okay.
He was called and trained up, and God spoke to him. And then Israel has lost the ark.
Okay, so this is, we've seen Samuel born in a miraculous fashion, by the way. Of course, his mother dedicates him to God, as she said that she would do. 1 Samuel 2 contains a song that Hannah composed as praise to God, which we saw bears striking similarities to the Song of Mary, the Magnificat, over in the Gospel according to Luke. I mean, when you read them side by side, it is just striking, the parallels. And so Mary, it seems, is very clearly drawing on Hannah as some sort of example for her, that God was visiting her in a special way to bring her a child who would do special things. And so we even saw language describing Samuel as growing in stature, favor with God and man, which is very similar to the way we see Jesus described. So I do think that Samuel functions as a type of sorts of Christ, all right? So, but what Joe said, so we see him growing. We saw him commissioned as a prophet, you'll remember. So he functions in Israel as a priest, he functions as a prophet, and as a judge. So he's not a king, but he is in some sense, some way having an administrative role, it would appear, over the people. Much like his predecessor Eli was doing. Eli's not described as a prophet, but he's a priest, and he also judges the people for 40 years. So there's a battle. The Philistines have come against Israel. The Philistines will be a thorn in Israel's side for a long time. They're a coastal people. Scholars tell us that they probably originally came from the area of Greece, and that they came by sea. So they're a coastal people in southwestern Israel. They're part of those that were not fully subdued under Joshua, the people who were in the land who were not fully subdued during the conquest. So they're going to come back as, again, a kind of a perpetual thorn in the side of Israel for some time. And that's what happens in 1 Samuel chapter 4. They draw up in battle, and the Israelite army is defeated, and they have this brilliant idea that they're going to bring God to the fight. And so they go and they get the ark, which is just a box covered in gold that contains sacred items. It's essentially the throne of Israel's God in the Holy of Holies. So this is something that's going to play kind of a role in what we're going to see tonight. In the ancient world, temples were well known. It wasn't striking that the Israelites had a temple for their God. Everybody had temples for their gods. It was a way for the supernatural realm, the natural realm to sort of intersect. So you had a house for the deity where the people would meet with the deity and they would worship him. That's what Israel's doing. So there's nothing unusual in that, but what is very unusual, what is indeed unique about Israel's situation is in their temple, they do not have an image of their God, right? In all the other cultures who, bordered Israel, these polytheistic nations that worship many gods, if you went into one of their temples, at the center of the temple, sort of, where everything is, the thing around which everything else is oriented is an image of the God. We're going to see that tonight. Israel doesn't have that. The closest that Israel comes to having something like that, and almost is wrong to even say the closest, because again, there is no image of the God, but in the central part of their tabernacle, their temple space, is this box called the Ark of the Covenant, which was a symbol for the people of their relationship with God. And so according to the writer of Hebrews, what does this box contain? The budding rod, the Ten Commandments, the manna, all right? And so within the ark itself, you have the Ten Commandments, you have the covenant documents. You have the treaty that's been established between God and the people, which tells the people what they're expected to do and reminds the people of what has been done for them, right? So this is a summation of sorts of the law, right? So they think, well, we're going to take God with us because this is God's throne. He dwells above the two angels, the two cherubim that are on top of this golden box. We're going to take him, and what happens? They're defeated again, and they lose the ark. And what happens when news comes back to Shiloh that the ark has been taken by the Philistines? Who dies? Eli. Right. They have already died. News comes back. Eli's sitting on his judgment seat, and he falls over, he dies. He's gone. He's dead. The text doesn't tell us this, but it could be the case that the Philistines destroy Shiloh at this time. Shiloh is the religious hub of Israel. Shiloh ceases to be that for Israel from here on, until the time of David, when Jerusalem becomes not just the capital city politically, but also the capital city religiously. Because the priests, the family of Eli, remember God, and what did God say about your family? They're coming down. They flee to Nob, which is incidentally where they are when Saul will later slaughter them because they helped David. And then there's only one of them who escapes that. That's Abiathar, who serves as high priest until he is deposed in 1 Kings chapter 2 by Solomon. And another priest from another lineage, Zadok, is then promoted to high priest. He was also very influential under David, but he's promoted to high priest. And what does 1 Kings say? Why is it that Solomon deposed Abiathar? I mean, I'm sure, Solomon had his reasons for doing so, but it's all from God because of what God said was going to happen to Eli's family as a result of the sin that's going on there, okay? So now let's come to chapter 5. And oh, by the way, we're going to go as long as we can. I'm going to try to get everybody out of here, 15 minutes early. So we're just going to be reading pretty large swaths of this text because chapter 5 and chapter 6 go together. They're really all part of this story. And if you want to know the point of all of this, so as we're kind of running through this narrative and picking up all these details, and I'll stop occasionally and we'll talk about it, I want you to keep one thing in mind. What is all of this intended to communicate? Well, I think it's found in verse 20. It's a question, all right? When the ark makes its way back into Israel, and we're going to get there, I doubt we'll make it there tonight, there's a question that's asked because something happens. Again, we'll get there. But I think this is the key to this whole narrative. Why is all of this being told to us? The men of Beth Shemesh said, "Who is able to stand before the Lord, this holy God?" The point of the narratives that we're going to be looking at in chapter 5 and chapter 6 all have to do with this theme of holiness. Treating God as He deserves, regarding God as He deserves, reverencing God as He deserves, okay? And the wrath of God which breaks out against those who failed to do so. So let's pick up at chapter 5, verse 1. Now the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then so they take it back to their land. The Philistines didn't belong to one country. As we're going to see, there were 5 Philistine cities, the Pentapolis, that were each ruled by a lord of the Philistines, all right? So something like city-states. Again, it wasn't one country, but sort of 5 cities. They all shared, the people there were of the same, tribe. I mean, it was still the same kind of, genetic stock of people, right? But they had never come together to form one country. There were sort of 5 cities that banded together, all right, of these Philistine people. And so this is what's going on. They take it back to their land. And then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it to the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon. So who's Dagon? False god, right? False god. Has anybody ever heard anything about Dagon before? Maybe you've heard somebody teach on this text or preach on this text. Has anybody ever heard anything about Dagon? Yes. Okay. Anybody, does that ring a bell with anybody? Something about fish? It's kind of interesting. It was generally thought that Dagon was a fish god of sorts, and that he had the body of a man and the head of a fish is how I think most people have generally thought that he was framed. So his idol looked like a head of a fish, body of a man. But in more recent times, Hebrew scholars have said, well, yeah, Dagon is similar to the Hebrew word for fish, but actually there's a word in Hebrew or a Semitic word that you find in different Semitic languages that probably best explains him, and it's the word for grain. And so I think most of your scholars these days are going to say, no, he's not a fish god. He's some sort of god of the harvest, a fertility god of sorts. But it doesn't really matter, okay? He's a false god. And he's some sort of chief deity, if not the chief deity, among the Philistines. So they have just conquered Israel. Who is Israel's God? Yahweh. They recognize that this ark is the ark of their God. It is in some way connected to the God of Israel. Maybe they even confuse it and think, well, as strange as it might seem, this is their image, okay? I mean, we know from what we've already seen, they're not really up to speed on everything about Israelite theology. I mean, when the Israelites come against them and they bring the ark in the first place, they're talking about gods coming to the battlefield and, gods plural. So they're not really up to speed on everything, so we don't know what's exactly going on in their mind. But what is clear is they know that this is associated with Israel's God. Why do they put it in Dagon's temple? Because in conquering Israel, by the help, in their minds, of Dagon, who else do they think that they have conquered? Or who else do they think Dagon has conquered? Yahweh. Yahweh. So in putting the ark that is connected to Israel's God Yahweh into the temple of their deity, they're not in any way saying that Yahweh, Israel's God, is on par with Dagon. Don't get that reading. They put him in Dagon's temple as subservient to Dagon. Think about it like an ancient person. When you would go to battle in the ancient world, it was more than just your country versus another country, your people versus another people, your tribe versus another tribe. It was also your God versus their God. And whoever won, they had the stronger gods. So, without reading any more, how do you think this is going to go for Dagon and for the people of Philistia? Not well. Not well at all. They think that their God has just conquered Yahweh. They have failed to realize, no. God is in complete control over everything that has happened. The Philistines are merely a pawn in his hand that he has used to bring discipline to his people. And if he allowed his ark to be taken, it's because he has a reason for so doing. Okay? So let's look at that reason. Verse 3, when the Ashdodites arose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. Now, I love this text because it's funny. It might not seem funny, but it is. Okay? If you think about what's going on here, this is pretty hilarious, actually. Because in putting the ark next to Dagon, they're saying, God, Israel's God, is subservient to our God. He bows before him. Well, they come in the next morning, and who's bowing before whom? Dagon is now on his face before Israel's God. And then look at the rest of the verse. So they took Dagon and set him in his place again. So not only does he fall down in front of the thing that represents Yahweh, but he can't even get up again. He has to be picked up by his worshipers who think that he won the day, and he has to be placed in his spot again. I mean, this is mockery, folks, right? This is cluing you in case you didn't realize, this Dagon is nothing compared with Israel's God. But when they arose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. We just read that. The head of Dagon, actually, we did see that. I'm sorry, verse 4 again. So he's fallen on his face again. We've already seen that one time, but notice what's different. That's what I'm trying to say. Sorry, I got confused there for a second. The head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. So he falls over first time, they pick him back up. He falls over again, loses his hands and his head in the process. Which incidentally, there's going to be a famous Philistine by the name of Goliath who's also going to fall down before Israel's God because he's insulting Israel's God. And he's also going to lose his head. You guys know that story? We'll get there later. Therefore, verse 5, neither the priest of Dagon nor all who enter Dagon's house tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. So little superstition arose in the wake of all of what is happening. Now the hand of the Lord was heavy on the Ashdodites, and he ravaged them and smote them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territory. So both this key Philistine city and the surrounding environs. The Lord's hand, it says, is heavy upon him, and he's smiting them with tumors. What kind of tumors? Is this cancer? Is this something else? I personally like there's been different thoughts on what this might be, but as we're going to see later, mice are somehow involved in this because when they send the ark back, they make images of these tumors. It's crazy. It's weird. But they think that that's what they need to do. But they also make images of five golden mice. So some have thought this is bubonic plague. If you know your history, bubonic plague was what ravaged Europe during the Middle Ages. Killed about a third of Europe's population over the course of a few centuries. So this could be something like that. We don't know. It is just, whatever it is, it's awful. This pestilence that has broken out upon the Philistines. Verse 7, when the men of Ashdod saw that it was so, they said, the ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us, for his hand is severe on us and on Dagon our God. So they sent and gathered all the lords of the Philistines and said to them, what shall we do with the ark of the God of Israel? And they said, let the ark of the God of Israel be brought around to Gath. And they brought the ark of the God of Israel around. What's their solution? Send it to another town. Don't send it back. Just send it to another town. So they're not yet willing to admit defeat. We may be able to salvage this situation in some way. We just know, according to the Ashdodites, the Philistines that lived in Ashdod and around it, we just got to get rid of this thing in some way. So send it to one of the other chief Philistine cities, Gath, which, by the way, is where Goliath is from. Goliath is from this city of Gath, all right? Which makes it kind of strange that he's just, I guess he would have to be, well, anyway, it doesn't matter. But it almost makes you wonder, did he not hear about this when he's just trumpeting how weak the God of Israel is and how because he's just boasting, in 1 Samuel 17. I guess he would have been pretty young or not even born. But it's like, I guess they forgot about all of this, right? Verse 9, they had it brought around. After they had it brought around, the hand of the Lord was against the city of Gath with very great confusion. He smote them into the city, both young and old, so that tumors break out on them. Same thing that goes on in Ashdod happens in Gath. So they sent the ark of God to Ekron, sent it around to another chief city of the Philistines. And as the ark of God came to Ekron, the Ekronites cried out and said, they have brought the ark of God, of the God of Israel, around to us to kill us and our people. They sent therefore and gathered all the lords of the Philistines. Again, there were 5 of them, rulers of each of these towns. And they said, send away the ark of the God of Israel. Let it return to its own place so that it will not kill us and kill our people. For there was a deadly confusion throughout the city. The hand of God was very heavy there. And the men who did not die were smitten with tumors, and the cry of the city went up to heaven. So it takes them sending this thing around to 3 of the key towns of the Philistines before they say, okay, enough is enough, just get rid of it. All right? Any questions or comments so far? Yes, sir. Yeah. That's interesting, yeah. Who really is able to use their hands? That's interesting. That is interesting. I hadn't thought about that. So yeah, he loses his hands, he loses his head, and yet God's hands, metaphorically speaking, still very much intact, right? You see that power. I mean, and also one thing too, the language here, it's also reminiscent of the Exodus. I mean, we're going to see in the next chapter, the Egyptians actually mentioned. We have here again this contest between Yahweh and one of the deities of the nations. You may have heard this before. When God is sending plagues upon the people of Egypt, who is he judging in addition to the actual people of Egypt? Their gods. He's showing them in each of these areas, culminating, of course, with an assault upon the firstborn, an assault upon Pharaoh's household himself. I mean, it's an assault on everybody. I mean, showing, of course, that who the supreme deity is, that the gods of Egypt are utterly incapable of stopping this, stopping what is happening, right? And so you have something that's very reminiscent here. The Lord hands heavy upon the Philistines just as he was upon Egypt. Let me see. I wanted to see maybe if we could get to the part of how they send the ark back, but that might take us a little bit too long, and I've already got 7:13. So I think we'll just end here tonight, and we'll pick up the story next week. Again, you're supposed to read these 2 chapters together, and which is why I pointed you to verse 20. What's the whole point of this? Once again, the holiness of God. So you have the children of Israel who are treating God with contempt in the form of their leadership, their priests. So God has judged them by literally abandoning them, by leaving them, because the child that is born, you'll remember, to Eli's grandchild, to his daughter-in-law at the end of, we didn't talk about this, but at the end of chapter 4, named Ichabod, the glory has departed, right? So God has judged Israel for the irreverence with which they've treated him. God is now judging the Philistines, and we're going to see at the end of the chapter, the ark goes back, and the children of Israel in one area, one locale, some of them are judged there as well. So the idea, I think, in this part of 1 Samuel is that the ark of God is not resting naturally at any place. It's out of place everywhere it goes, whether it's in Israel, whether it's in Philistia, whether it goes back to Israel. So we're seeing what? Israel is in the same boat as her neighbors. Israel is as sinful as her neighbors, despite God's covenant promises, despite the fact that the very throne of God is in their midst, that God himself is sitting enthroned on the cherubim. Despite all of this, the human heart is the human heart. Okay, the human heart is the human heart. Israel, chosen for a great vocation, a great calling, as God's special people through whom he's going to bring the redemption of the world. He calls them to be his missionary people, actually. We'll talk about that some as we continue in the book of Jonah, because Jonah is actually representing Israel in his failure to preach and to bring light to the Gentiles. That was Israel's vocation as a kingdom of priests. But the issue is, once again, and we've seen this in Genesis, haven't we? Who is the seed? Who is the seed? Who is the seed in Sunday school? Well, certainly not Israel. Israel's got the same problems everybody else has, right? Until we get to the true Israelite, the one in whom all of the promises come to their fruition, who is Jesus Christ, who is the fulfillment of the promise that Israel would bless the nations. Okay? Well, we'll go ahead and finish there. We'll pick up, Lord willing, next week and do chapter 6, okay? Our Father, I'm sorry, Charles?
Was God still sitting enthroned above the cherubim, or was going from city to city?
Yeah. So the glory, I mean, she has this baby, right? And she names him Ichabod, which is just it's a one word question. It means, where's the glory? And in other words, it's gone. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know necessarily that it would have been visible in terms of a cloud, but I mean, God is very much still connected with this thing. Definitely. I mean, the glory of God himself has departed Israel because the ark is gone. Absolutely. So what that might have been like, I don't know that I can answer that question, but what might it have looked like? But God is still very much connected with this thing as his sort of the symbol of his presence. Good question. Father, go with us now, we pray, and I pray for our choir members who are going to be meeting, and that you would bless their work tonight. And we look forward to seeing one another again on Sunday as we come back together again to worship you in Jesus' name.